Okay, so that's the Phaedo. There's a lot that we could say on it. We could definitely spend an entire course on it. In a sense, we are spending an entire course on it. We're going to be coming back to it in a variety of ways. Um, but we are going to I'm going to choose just a few sections to elaborate on. And I'm also going to read the Phaedo from a number of perspectives, from political perspective, feminist perspective, ecological perspective. And so we'll see not only the enduring significance of this particular text and Plato's philosophy in general, but we'll also, I'll be demonstrating and you'll be engaging in different kinds of readings. And often we think that there's just one way of reading something, but there are a number of ways of reading any given text. Okay, so this is going to be probably one of the longest lectures. Sorry about that, but there's a lot of ground that we need to cover here. If Socrates' dualistic views are kind of implicit in the Apology, they're on full display in the Phaedo. Socrates' dualism is both hierarchical and exclusionary. He not only believes that reality, human reality included, is divided into two distinct realms, one material and one immaterial, but further, he does not see those two realms as equal. One is better, one is truer than the other, and thus one is faced with a situation of scarcity, in which one has to choose between one or the other. It is, in his view, rational to choose the higher over the lower, and in his estimation, as we've seen, it's always the immaterial soul that is higher than the body. In fact, another way that we could think about the cave in general is that the people in the cave represent us when we're experiencing reality through our senses. What we're experiencing in Socrates' estimation is a mere shadow of reality. The person who leaves the cave is the one who is able to discern the immaterial essence of things. But we'll get into what all of that means in a second. So this intra-subjective dynamic, a dynamic between different parts within the same subject, also always has an intersubjective dynamic. That's why metaphysical beliefs have political implications. The way you answer a metaphysical question like, what are my different parts, or do I have parts, and if I do have parts, what are those different parts, and are those parts separate, and if they're separate, are they separate from one another really, and if they are separate from one another, then is one better than the other? That for reasons that we're going to see explicitly now, often has implications for the different parts, not only of a political body. So, um, uh, this intra-subjective dynamic, a dynamic between different parts within the same subject, also always has an intersubjective dynamic, a dynamic between different subjects. In fact, the first thing Socrates does in the Phaedo, you'll remember, is to send away the women. He does so because the mind, in its desire to exist autonomously from the influence of the body, also needs to exist autonomously from the influence of the passions and the emotions. And in his view, women are, unlike men, incapable of excluding their emotions. Thus, his hierarchical dualism, according to which the mind is superior to the body, translates into a hierarchy according to which reason is superior to the passions, which should be excluded from its thought process, which in turn translates into an exclusion of anyone who is deemed incapable of making that exclusion. And women, in his view, are incapable of making that exclusion. Socrates has already been excluded from the city, indeed from the scene. Indeed, the scene that we're talking about in the Phaedo is in his prison cell, where he awaits his death. Not only has he been excluded from the city, he's about to be excluded from the entire realm of the living. And while in that extreme position of having been excluded, he himself enacts a further exclusion when he orders all of the women, including his own wife, to be excluded from the ensuing conversation. So let's talk about exclusion for a moment. The story I think a lot of us are operating with is this kind of vision of historical progress. Things are always getting better. And specifically, they're getting better politically by overcoming exclusions in the name of greater and greater levels of inclusivity. Think about voting. Travel back a few hundred years and no one can vote for anything. Um, then come the democratic revolutions of the 18th century. To take the US as an example, at that point, a very small percentage of the population acquires the right to vote, white landowning men. Eventually, black men get to vote, and eventually women do as well. Yet it seems as though there's always at least one group that's excluded from whatever rights are granted a portion of the population. So we're faced with two possibilities. One is that we just need to keep going. We need to keep expanding on the group that's included, working towards greater and greater levels of inclusivity until everyone's included under the umbrella of moral and political consideration. Or option two, we could argue or begin to suspect that exclusion is somehow built into the very fabric of our basic worldview. I mean, what if it's the case that the reason why we keep having these political exclusions and we can't quite seem to get to a place of true universal equality is because our political landscape is rooted in our political beliefs, and our political beliefs are rooted in metaphysical beliefs, which themselves are hierarchical and justify exclusion. So maybe our exclusionary metaphysics is really the problem. So if the latter is the case, then if we wish to create a world of true equality, one that overcomes the hierarchy between those that matter and those who do not, then we'll have to overcome the hierarchies built into that basic worldview. In that sense, Socrates' exclusion of the women at the outset of the Phaedo, grounded and justified as it is on his hierarchical belief that reason is superior to passion, perhaps offers us some insight into the ways in which intrasubjective, hierarchical, exclusionary thinking leads to both grounds and leads to intersubjective, hierarchical, exclusionary thinking. Perhaps the point is not to argue against his belief that women are incapable of setting their passions to one side, but rather to question if one really ought to. And indeed, to question whether one really can. Hierarchical dualism, the belief that A is better than B, after all, is only possible if there in fact is a dualism between A and B. But is there really such a thing as a completely passionless reason? Are reason and passion really these two completely separate entities? And while we're on the subject, is there even really such a thing as an immaterial mind that exists completely dualistically separate from a material body? Maybe the work to be done, I mean, if it's the case that political dualisms are grounded in, and exclusions are grounded in metaphysical dualisms and exclusions, then maybe the work to be done in order to work towards a more egalitarian future is to question the validity of dualism as such. All right, so returning to our story. Once Socrates sends the women away, he finds the men no more capable of excluding their passions than the women were, to his deep dismay. They are crying at the thought that they're about to lose their beloved master. This frustrates Socrates deeply. Not only has he been unable, despite his best efforts, to send the passions out of his death row jail cell, the fact that they are crying is proof, in his view, that his students have misunderstood his message, his teachings. After all, if his central teaching has always been that we are in fact our immaterial minds, and not our material bodies, then he is not, in fact, about to die. Only his body is. And not only is a dimension of reality, his body, that really has nothing to do with him, according to his beliefs, about to expire, but that dimension, his body, he'll go on to argue, is in fact the true jail cell that he's been imprisoned in his whole life, and that all of his students are presently imprisoned in. And with death, As the separation of the soul from the body, he anticipates final and the first true liberation. If there should be any passion in his view, it should be great joy. The Phaedo opens with a citizen excluded from the city, continues with an exclusion of women in a bid to exclude the passions, proceeds through an argument for the exclusion of the body, and ends with a literal exclusion of the body, when Socrates happily drinks the hemlock poison. Okay, so what is Socrates' argument for the why he should be excited, certainly not sad, when he's about to die? Here's probably, for me, the most important line from all of the Phaedo. And now I will make clear to you, O my judges, why he who has lived as a true philosopher should be of good cheer when about to die. To understand Socrates' argument here, we'll need to say a bit more about his hierarchical dualism and how it relates to his understanding of the task of the philosopher. Reality's two dimensions consist, as we've seen, in a material one and an immaterial one, in terms of what makes us us. That would be our bodies and our minds, or our souls. The material realm, in a larger sense, consists in the practically infinite number of particular examples of things. There's so many chairs, so many cats, so many particular acts of justice and injustice. The question the philosopher asks, and maybe what got him in so much trouble, is, in Socrates' view, what do all chairs have in common that justifies us in using the same word to refer to all of them? What makes a chair a chair? What makes a cat a cat? What is a chair? What is a cat? And what is justice? Whatever it is that makes a chair, whatever that is the essence of a chair. That essence is not itself material. Particular chairs have weight and dimensions, but the essence of a chair, the set of defining characteristics something needs in order to be included in a category chair, does not. Socrates, how much does a cat weigh? I don't know, you can weigh it, but how much does the concept of cat weigh? The idea of cat, the set of defining characteristics that all cats have in common, the essence of a cat. How much does that weigh? It doesn't have any weight. Socrates calls these essences ideas, eidos. And it is these that the philosopher is interested in. The philosopher is uninterested, ultimately, in the realm of particular material examples, and as such is ultimately uninterested in the material realm in its entirety. Put otherwise, he turns his attention away from the realm of particulars and towards the realm of universals, to what any given set of particulars have in common. To find the universal essence, say, of a chair, one's procedure would be to strip away, to exclude from one's vision in consideration everything that is particular to any given chair, say its color or size or material, until one arrives at those characteristics without which the chair would not be a chair. If we change its color, it's still a chair. But if we took away its back, or perhaps its legs, it wouldn't be. If so, then having a back and having legs are essential defining characteristics of what make a chair a chair. So those characteristics, which if you took them away, the chair would still be a chair, are inessential, while those characteristics which if you took them away, the chair would no longer be a chair, are essential. Thus, the project of finding the essence always involves a process of exclusion. Now, if we imagine the situation of a subject turning its attention to an object, the objective realm, what the subject focuses its attention on is dualistically split into two dimensions as well, one material and one immaterial. But likewise, the subjective size of things is split into a material and immaterial dimension as well. It's with his material body, with all of its senses, that he's capable of turning his attention to the material realm of particular examples. And it's with his immaterial mind that he's capable of turning his attention to ideas. To see this, imagine you taking a test. It's a final, the whole class is resting on it. The teacher places a cat in the middle of a room and simply asks everyone one question. Just write down its color. It seems totally easy, except everyone's blindfolded and so can't use their bodies, and in particular can't use their senses, and in particular can't use their eyes to discern the color of the cat. One could guess, but it would be impossible to complete the test with any real certainty. Imagine further that a student complains that the test is unfair, so the teacher decides to remove the blindfold, but then to change the question from one about this particular cat with its particular color to one about the essence of cats, and asks, instead of what color is this particular cat, he asks, what makes a cat a cat? What is the essence, the idea of a cat? In that case, removing the blindfold is of little help, since it's with one's mind that one discerns essences. The fact that one can now use one's body to complete a task that can only be completed with one's mind is of no help. The branch of philosophy concerned with the ultimate nature of reality is called metaphysics. That which is concerned with knowledge is epistemology, the root of which is the ancient Greek word episteme, meaning knowledge. Socrates' metaphysical dualism, according to which reality is ultimately divided into two realms, leads him not only to a dualistic political worldview, where the philosopher kings should rule over the common unenlightened people, but it also leads him to an epistemological dualism. There is one method by which we attain knowledge of particulars, namely the body, and another method by which we attain knowledge of universals, namely the mind. If we return again to another branch of philosophy, political philosophy, we might wonder whether there's a connection between the notion of universality with which Socrates is operating, the universality of essences, which one arrives at by stripping away everything that is particular about any given phenomenon, and the political project of creating a society that embraces everyone universally. Think about it for a moment. Think about just the language in which we articulate our visions of universality, whether in the founding documents of the United States government or in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's always, we believe that rights are universal regardless of, and then we set out a whole set of particulars. So what we're in effect doing is we're saying that we're going to attain the universal by excluding the particular. We get upset when people aren't excluding the particular, when they're being nationalistic or sexist or racist. But maybe that gesture of excluding the particular, of excluding particular groups, kind of tribalism, is rooted in that gesture of exclusion is rooted in the exclusionary gesture of creating a notion of universality that excludes particularity. The question arises, could there be another metaphysical vision of universality, one that does not itself rely on the exclusion of the particular, that could provide the grounding for a truly inclusive political vision of universality? Maybe a society that values political egalitarianism is doomed to failure if it relies on a hierarchical metaphysics, like Plato's. But remember, Plato is no fan of an egalitarian democratic society. In Socrates' view, the philosopher, in turning away from the realm of particular examples to the realm of ideas, in doing so, he turns from his body to his mind. But he struggles in doing so. Because in between the pure realm of universal ideal essences and particular examples lie images. Try this. Pause the video and close your eyes and try to figure out the essential nature of a chair. Okay, welcome back. You probably found that you were immediately presented with images of particular chairs. Those images are residues, memories. They're all particular. They're not universal. But where do they come from? Well, they're residues, memories of sensory experiences you've previously had with your bodily encounter with particular things. And so, despite you, the philosopher's best efforts, You remain in the realm of the particular. Despite your best efforts to attain the realm of the universal, you remain in the realm of the particular. You're unable to transcend, to exclude the realm of the particular. At least, and this is Socrates' point, as long as you're connected to your body. The philosopher does his best while alive to disconnect from the body, but ultimately he'll only disconnect from his body when he dies. Just as he was unable to exclude passion from his prison cell, he is unable to exclude the realm of the particular from the mind. The philosopher is thus unable to transcend his body until death. If death consists in the separation of soul from body, then the philosopher has been pursuing death his whole life, and his argument is complete as to why the philosopher should be of good cheer when he's about to die at this point. He hopes he has, with this argument, finally routed all passion from the room. I mean, why would anybody be upset to learn that a philosopher is about to die if he's about to get what he wants? But there is a lingering concern. How, his students ask, can he be so certain that his soul is, in fact, going to survive outside of his body? And so we turn to his second argument, his argument for the immortality of the soul. Specifically, of the several arguments he makes, his argument from analogy is what we're going to focus on here in the interest of time. In essence, his argument is that it's in the nature of the realm of particular material examples to change. All change, all transience, all becoming exists on the level of particular things. Your cat changes, so does your chair. And your cat and chair will eventually go through the most significant change of all, death. I'm sorry. When they transition from a state of being to a state of nothingness. Having come to be, they will eventually cease to be. We all will. But these events, both the small and large changes any particular being goes through over the course of its existence, as well as the ultimate change of ceasing to exist altogether, have no bearing on the ideal realm of universal essences, of which these particular examples were mere instances. Our cats will die, but the idea of cat will be unaffected. Our cats will change positions, moving from one side of the room to the other. And yet again, this will have no bearing on the ideal essence of what it takes for a cat to be a cat. Particular cats die. The idea of catness, does not. Particulars are mortal. Ideas are immortal. And the distinction between the particular and universal dimensions is analogous to that between the body and the mind, with which one accesses each of them. The body accesses the particular is mortal, so the body is mortal. The mind accesses the universal is immortal, therefore the mind or soul is as well. Why would we think then, why would we think that an immortal being, like ideas, can be accessed by a mortal soul? If the soul is analogous to the immortal ideas, then the argument goes the soul must itself be immortal. In the end, Socrates drinks the hemlock. His entire philosophical enterprise points in a direction that he should do so happily. He's finally free of his body. Having briefly considered the text from the vantage of feminist and political philosophy, then, let's look at it from the perspective of one final branch of philosophy of nature, specifically the philosophical movement known as deep ecology, according to which, if we are to avert environmental catastrophe, we'll need more than engineers. We'll need to understand that crisis's deep philosophical roots. It's been said that we don't have to wait for World War III. It's already begun. The combatants are the humans and the rest of the earth, and we are killing it. We're winning. The question arises, why would we go to war with our own home? And doesn't have anything to do with the way that Socrates went to war with his own body. From a deep ecology perspective, the answer is that somehow we have become, well, yes, first of all, there's a connection. But in general, from a deep ecology perspective, the answer is that somehow the reason why we're attacking our own home is because we've become alienated from our home, from the earth. The word ecos I should mention, is a Greek word, and we get our word economy as well as our word ecology from it, and it means home. Um, from a deep ecology perspective, we're alienated from our home. We're alienated from the earth. We no longer experience it as our home. And so we no longer experience its problems as having any real relevance to us. I mean, why should we care anymore for the planet Earth than the planet Mars if we experience ourselves on some deep level as aliens to both? The root of the environmental crisis, in this view, is the erroneous belief in a dualistic opposition between humanity and the rest of nature, according to which not only are we separate from nature, but because dualisms are almost inevitably hierarchical in nature, and hierarchical dualisms are almost inherently exclusionary in nature, and they justify exclusion. We are more important and valuable than the rest of nature. Thus, we find ourselves in this kind of absurd situation, if you really think about it, where we believe that we're faced with this situation of scarcity, where we have to choose between the health of the economy and the health of the ecology, as if the economy could flourish if the planet that hosts us can no longer do so. I remember once I was a little kid, my best friend Yuri asked me, I was maybe like 7, and he said to me, "Hey Ken, if you had a choice between $1 billion, but I would have to kill you, or not, what would you choose?" And I was just like, "Oh my God, $1 billion! $1 billion would be awesome." And he said, like, "Aha, gotcha. You answered wrong. Because if I gave you $1 billion, but I had to kill you, you'd be dead and you wouldn't be able to enjoy it." And I was like, "Oh, darn." But I wonder if something like that isn't what's going on with us. You know, every time I hear something like, "Yeah, we could do that." I mean, the engineers have come up with designs for how we could transform our society into one that would rely on renewable energy, and that would be really great. Except it's just so expensive. So I guess we can't really spend that. We'll have to keep the $1 billion instead. All right, so I can't talk about it too long without getting depressed. But now, if anyone were to insist, going back to this idea of a dualism between humans and the rest of nature, if anyone were to insist on the dualism between humans and the rest of nature, and were pressed a bit, they would likely, after a bit, accede that there is a dimension of us that is in fact part of nature, and that dimension would be our animal, flesh and bones bodies. But the dualistic argument would go, we have another dimension, an immaterial dimension that transcends those bodies, and in doing so transcends the entirety of the natural realm. Indeed, if we transcend and exist beyond the material realm, we certainly transcend and exist beyond the natural realm, which is itself part of the material realm. Thus, just as the patriarchal, hierarchical dualism between men and women is grounded on that between reason and passion, so is the ecological hierarchical dualism between humanity and nature grounded in that between mind and body. It is on account of our identifying with our supposedly immaterial dimension that we come to believe that, no matter the fate of the earth, we, immaterial souls, will be just fine. Could Socrates' philosophically justified suicide have prefigured the ecological suicide, the ecocide, in which we're currently engaged? Perhaps Plato's metaphysical dualism lies at the root of the environmental crisis as well. And only if we were to turn to or develop a non-dualistic metaphysics, only if we do that are we going to be able to achieve an ecologically sustainable future. On the other hand, I mean, like from this perspective, Plato's really the problem. On the other hand, let's look at it a little bit differently. Turn to another dimension of all of this. Maybe we can find in Socrates' philosophy actually some clues about how to move forward to a more ecological paradigm. And in fact, maybe we can salvage some conception of dualism. For Socrates, turning away from the body not only makes one a good philosopher, it would make one a good person. He argues in the Phaedo, "For whence come wars and fightings and factions? Whence but from the body and lusts of the body? For wars are occasioned by the love of money, and money has to be acquired for the sake and in the service of the body. The distinction he is drawing on here is ultimately between scarcity and abundance. Imagine two sisters fighting over the single slice of pizza they found in the kitchen. Suddenly, the fighting gives way when they realize that, in fact, below the box containing the single slice lies another box with an entire pizza. In shifting from a situation of scarcity, when there is not supply enough to meet the demand, to a situation of abundance, when there is more than enough supply to meet the demand, they would shift in that situation from war to peace as well. But this solution to war is not ultimately reliable. Other situations will arise when there is no such situation of abundance, when there's really not that much pizza to go around. Indeed, it's the nature of the material realm, and hence the nature of the objects of the body's desires, to be subject to scarcity. In any given society, then, if its members fully identify with their bodies, and so pursue their body's desires, at some point they're going to run into the problem of scarcity, and there's going to be wars, fighting, and factions. Indeed, if I give you any physical object, I no longer have that physical object. If you and I compete for a physical object, the situation of scarcity pits us against one another. If you win, I lose, and if I win, you lose. Thus, we find ourselves being made happy by each other's misery, and miserable by each other's happiness. It would seem that, in such a situation, wars, fighting, and factions are all but inevitable. But now consider the objects of the mind's desires, namely ideas. If I share my food with you, I have less food. But if I share my ideas with you, I have those ideas just the same. Indeed, when it comes to food or any material possession, there will always be limits to my generosity. At some point, I will have shared so much that I no longer possess anything, and so before that happens, my body master will insist that I limit my love and generosity, on pain of death, no matter how strong those inclinations are. But if I fundamentally identify with my mind, then I have no similar reason not to share. I have no reason to compete, and so there will be no cause anymore for wars, fightings, and factions. When two bodies meet each other in a situation of scarcity, one's happiness will mean the other's sadness, and vice versa, and thus they meet, in a sense, as enemies. But when two minds meet each other, they meet always in a situation of abundance, for the objects of their desire are themselves inherently abundant and never subject to the possibility of scarcity. I can literally share any of these ideas with the whole world and be no poorer for having done so. I have less cake if I share some with you, but I have no less of the idea of cake if I share that with you. When we turn to discuss capitalism or economic competition and its critics, this dualistic view between scarcity and abundance will again be helpful. Maybe the root of our problems, ecological, political, and moral, lie in our having adopted an economic system, capitalism, based in competition and hence scarcity. And the solution is to move toward an economic system rooted in abundance and cooperation, one in which my neighbor's success does not imply my failure, one in which we do not meet as enemies, or as enemies would. For Socrates, the shift we all need to make is to at least cut greatly down on wars and conflicts in the world, is from identifying with our bodies, with their material needs and desires, subject as they are to scarcity, to identifying with our minds, with their immaterial needs and desires, which are inherently abundant. For the anti-capitalist, the shift is likewise from a paradigm of scarcity to one of abundance. And here's one last place where I think we can really, it's really helpful to think about scarcity and abundance, and I think will be particularly helpful if any of you are thinking about environmental engineering. So, from an ecological perspective, environmental engineering perspective in particular again, the stark choice humanity is facing today is between a civilization that meets its energy needs through increasingly scarce fossil fuels or intrinsically abundant renewables. So the distinction between fossil fuel energy technology, fossil energy technology, and renewable energy technology is that distinction can be understood in terms of the distinction between scarcity and abundance. If the electricity you're using right now to watch this lecture is harnessed by transforming coal or natural gas into electricity, then there is presently, as a result of this activity, less coal or natural gas in the world. If alternatively, and this is what we really mean when we talk about alternative fuels, that same electricity was grounded in, say, solar or wind, there would be no less sun in the world, nor wind, as a result of this activity or energy consumption. If two countries run on fossil fuels, there is every reason to believe that at some point they will find themselves competing over a scarce quantity of those fuels, and thus the happiness of one will entail the misery of the other, and they'll meet as enemies would. Not because of the coldness of their respective hearts or lack of commitment to principles of justice. If, alternatively, they run their respective societies on renewables, each of their successes is no longer predicated on the other's failures. Fossil fuels are scarce, renewables are abundant. We can find then in Phaedo and Socrates and Plato's philosophies writ large, not only a dualistic paradigm that needs to be overcome in our bid for a more sustainable future, but clues as to how to think about the shift towards that sustainable future as well. Perhaps the shift we need to make is not turning away from the body, and consequently nature as such, but simply from a paradigm of scarcity to one of abundance. And if we think of that shift on the level of the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, it need not require us to shift our focus or identities from the material embodied realm at all. And hence, it need not give rise to a dualistic belief about the separation of humans from the rest of nature, from the rest of nature, nor the hierarchy implied by that humans are somehow or other better than nature, or our values are more important than the rest of nature. And if all of those ideologies lie at the foundation of the actual concrete exclusion, like the chopping down of the rainforest, of non-human nature, then perhaps to get at the root of the ecological crisis, we need to investigate the metaphysical underpinnings of that crisis. Okay, so that is my presentation on the Phaedo. You can turn now to the questions and answer them, and go to the discussion board and discuss this with your family and friends, and I look forward to seeing what you all come up with. Okay, thanks for hanging out with me today.